I think it is very appropriate that we are having a lecture on Daniel O'Connell on, as Grace has said, Liberation Day. And Daniel O'Connell was acclaimed in Ireland as the liberator, the person who had won civil rights, freedom for the Irish people. It's also the day a new pope has just been elected, an American, Pope Leo XIV. And of course, Daniel O'Connell was the person who won Catholic Emancipation. But in a way, I don't really like the use of the term Catholic Emancipation, because I think in the 21st century, it kind of obscures his great achievement, because we don't really understand what that meant. Was it the right to practice your religion? Was it the... Essentially what it was civil rights. Irish Catholics were inferior in their own country. Daniel O'Connell would say that you could walk down any street in Ireland and you could immediately tell who the Catholics were, because they wouldn't make your eye. They would bow down, they were broken down, they were embarrassed and ashamed. And he believed that they had been broken down by centuries of humiliation and defeat. So what Daniel O'Connell achieved in 1829 was not really a religious achievement. It was a victory which meant that Catholics, the majority of people on the island, were able to be elected to Parliament, were able to then represent their people, could be promoted in the law, could become judges, but could more importantly feel that they were equal in their own country. And what Daniel O'Connell was doing was he was raising a people who were on its knees, and he was convincing them that they were more than slaves. And it was an extraordinary civil rights achievement. It was achieved through exclusively peaceful means. And from that point on, Daniel O'Connell was loved and revered and hailed as the liberator. And he had a truly international reputation, not just for what he was winning in Ireland and how he was achieving it, but also because of his vehement opposition to slavery. Because Daniel O'Connell believed that civil rights should be championed wherever they were under attack or wherever they were denied to people. And he became a hugely respected international icon because of his opposition to slavery. And he was loved by African Americans. He was hugely respected by abolitionists. And when Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist, escaped from slavery and made his way to New York, the first place that he wanted to go to was Ireland, because he had heard so many stories of Daniel O'Connell. His master would spit out the name of O'Connell like it was a curse. And Frederick Douglass said that's when he first started to love the name of O'Connell. And he made his way to Ireland in 1845, and he spoke alongside O'Connell at an anti-slavery rally here in Dublin. And O'Connell, with typical modesty, introduced Douglass as the Black O'Connell of the United States. But in a way, he was also anointing him as a champion of freedom. And Frederick Douglass wrote that he hadn't believed the stories of O'Connell's oratory. He didn't believe that one person could stand up in front of a huge outdoor crowd and not only be heard by them, but that he would be able to make them laugh one minute, cry the next, that the way he could control them with the power of his words. But he said that as soon as he heard O'Connell speak, he realized that all the stories were true. He said that it was like listening to the rolling of thunder across a dusty summer's afternoon. And Douglass later wrote that when O'Connell died in 1847, it was a huge blow to the cause of freedom in the United States. And O'Connell made a lot of enemies because of his opposition to slavery. The repeal organizations in the southern states closed down completely because they were offended by what O'Connell was saying. But even in the north, people in America were disgusted that an Irishman thought that he could pronounce on internal affairs in America. And you had senior figures in the Catholic Church in New York writing to O'Connell, pleading with him, saying, well, we don't agree with slavery either, but you have to stop speaking about it. You are losing friends. And O'Connell refused. He said, I will continue to speak out. And he offended Americans because he would tell them, your Declaration of Independence, that you think is such a great document, is a hypocritical, flawed document, because it begins with the words that all men are created equal, and they are not. He said that George Washington, the much revered first president of the United States, was a hypocrite because he owned slaves and he only freed them on his deathbed. Daniel O'Connell shocked Queen Victoria because when a distinguished politician from Alabama visited O'Connell in the House of Commons in the 1830s, O'Connell's first question was, where are you from? His second question was, do you own slaves? And when he was told the answer was yes, he slammed the door in his face. And O'Connell would give speeches where he said that Americans who own slaves are like the wolves in the forest, and they should be denounced as such. And he would move his audience to tears as he would explain the plight of the enslaved woman, pregnant, knowing that her child could at any time be taken off her and sold into slavery, and a whole lifetime of abuse and suffering ahead. And he would explain that that woman knew that instead of giving birth to a blessing, she knew that she was passing on a curse. And Americans were offended. The American ambassador to Britain in the 1830s was a man called Andrew Stevenson. And Daniel O'Connell announced that this person should not be allowed in to Britain because he was a slave owner and a slave breeder. And O'Connell called on people to turn their backs on him. And Stevenson demanded an apology. And O'Connell refused. And Stevenson challenged him to a duel. And O'Connell again refused, saying that he thought a duel was a very foolish way of deciding who was wrong and who was right. And John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, was at that point back in the House of Representatives. And he took to the floor of Congress to denounce a conspiracy of the slave owners against the life of Daniel O'Connell. At the world's first anti-slavery convention in London in the early 1840s, Daniel O'Connell shook the room with his denunciations of slavery. And the great black abolitionist Charles Lennox Remond was at that. And he said afterwards, all my life, I believed I was an abolitionist, but I was wrong. Listening to O'Connell made me realize what true abolitionism was. And they described how his speech was like watching lightning flash across the sky as he struck out against the slave owners. So why did O'Connell speak out so much against slavery? Something that wasn't popular in Ireland, lost him friends and money in the United States, lost him friends in Britain. Abolitionism was not the great popular cause that it later became. It was because Daniel O'Connell knew what it was like to grow up in a state of inferiority. Now, Irish Catholics were slaves. They didn't suffer. They couldn't be sold in the way that African American slaves could. But he knew what it was like to be so inferior in your own country. And he felt a great empathy for those slaves. And that empathy was, in a way, his great strength, his great characteristic. And he was determined to be the champion of freedom, the champion of civil rights, and speak out against injustice wherever he found it and whatever the cost. And when people talk about him being this great orator, again, I think people are always a bit confused. And they think, oh, it must have been because he was such a tall man and he had such a powerful frame, or it must have been some, God-given gift that he was able to speak so powerfully. Daniel O'Connell trained to be an orator. He wasn't able to be educated in Ireland because of his religion. But he had a rich uncle, Hunting Cap, who sent him to the continent. And from there he went to England, and because a Catholic Relief Act had been passed, he was able to train to study to be a lawyer. But if that act hadn't been passed in 1793, O'Connell wouldn't have been able to become the greatest lawyer in Irish history. And O'Connell went to the British House of Commons and he studied how the great orators of the day projected their voices. He went to the theatre in London and he watched the actors and he learned. So it wasn't an accident that Daniel O'Connell was this great orator. He studied and trained and practiced. And he was still doing it 20, 30, 40 years later. In 1825, and O'Connell was 50 years old at this point, he went to London to start a new campaign because it looked like Catholic emancipation might finally be secured. And it passed the House of Commons, and then it was rejected in the House of Lords. But O'Connell was to give his first major speech on emancipation in England. And they'd hired a huge arena. 5,000 people were packed into it. And there were loads of speeches before O'Connell. And no one could be heard. And they were all out of their seats having to stand, straining. It was a hot day. People were unhappy, uncomfortable, annoyed. No one could be heard. Nothing was going right. And then O'Connell got up to speak. And he went around the room, put himself in front of one of the pillars, and then he said, "Oh, no, you can all sit down. Don't worry, you won't have any trouble hearing me." And then he proceeded to make fun of all the other speakers who hadn't been able to be heard. And then he delivered this brilliant oration. Now, why could O'Connell be heard and no one else could? It was because O'Connell had gone into that huge arena, that huge theatre, the night before with 4 of his closest friends. And he had tested the acoustics. And he had positioned his friends in various parts, and he had walked around until he found the one spot in front of a pillar where he could be heard. Now, what that says to me is that O'Connell, at the age of 50, wasn't relying on his reputation, or he wasn't just hoping that it would all go well. He was putting as much work into making sure it was a success as he had for his very first speech. So O'Connell created the person that he became. Born in May 1775, 250 years ago. Born just as the American War of Independence was breaking out. But growing up very much feeling that he was inferior in his own country. And being very much determined to change that. His greatest ambition was to be an Irish parliamentarian. But his religion prevented that. And then after 1800, the Act of Union abolishing the Irish Parliament prevented it. But that was his dream. After the passing of emancipation, journalists would always ask him, who was the greatest figure in Irish history? And he would remember the childhood orator that he had always admired, Henry Grattan. And he would say, Henry Grattan, after myself. So O'Connell was forced to go abroad to be educated. He trained in England to become a lawyer, and then returned home in the 1790s and was called to the bar in 1798. And it may surprise you to know he joined the United Irishmen, even though it was an illegal revolutionary organization, because he had been radicalized by his experiences in England. He opposed the mob violence of the French Revolution. But at that stage of his career, he wasn't the man of peace that we later think of. And we sometimes read back the later years to these earlier times when he was much more angry, much more hot-headed. He had lost his faith at this point. He didn't go to Mass. He didn't consider himself a Catholic. And he only recovered his faith after 1815. He was on a list of radicals that was sent to Dublin Castle, and he fled the city in the summer of 1798 when the rebellion broke out because he was afraid he would be arrested. And in the years ahead, when he made his first public speech, January 1800, denouncing this proposed Act of Union and calling for the Irish Catholics to reject it, even though they were excluded from that parliament, he was making himself out to be a champion of the Irish constitutional tradition, wanting there to be this Parliament for Ireland, but wanting Irish Catholics to be a part of it. And in the same way that he had trained to be a great orator, you also see him training to become a great lawyer. And he marked himself out as one of the great barristers in Ireland at that time, because he was one of the first Catholics to be practicing as a lawyer. But he couldn't be promoted. All the King's councils had to be Protestant, all the judges were Protestant, and they did not like this new generation of Catholic upstarts coming into their courts. There was one day O'Connell was waiting for his case to be heard, and the judge was bullying the young Catholic lawyer who was trying to make his case. And O'Connell intervened and he said, "My lord, I think this case should go to trial, and here are the reasons why." And the judge was furious and he said, "Mr. O'Connell, you don't have a brief in this case. It's none of your business. Sit down." And O'Connell refused to sit down. He said, "My lord, if this case does go to trial, I will have a brief, so it is my business." The judge, furious, he said, "Mr. O'Connell, when I was a lawyer at the bar, it was not my habit to anticipate what briefs I would get." And O'Connell just pointed his finger at him and he said, "My lord, when you were at the bar, I never took you as my model. And now that you're on the bench, I will not suffer your dictation." Well, the judge had never been talked to like that in his life. And he was so shocked and afraid, he backed down and allowed the case to go to trial. So O'Connell made himself out in the courtroom as a champion of the downtrodden, as someone who was prepared to stand up for his rights, for the rights of others. And he made himself a marked man. There was a famous case in 1813 where O'Connell denounced the Attorney General for some of the tactics that he had employed. And O'Connell said, "My lord, if the Attorney General had used those words about me outside of this courtroom, I would have horsewhipped him." Now, there were 3 judges here, and 2 of them were asleep. They woke up at that, and they said, "Mr. O'Connell, what are you saying? Did you just threaten the Attorney General?" And he goes, "No, forgive me. What I'm saying is, I'm glad the Attorney General is only saying those words here where there's people protecting him. Because if he said it anywhere else, I would horsewhip him." Well, uproar in the court. And the judges say, "Mr. O'Connell, we can arrest you for contempt of court. You cannot threaten the Attorney General. How dare you say this? Please clarify what you are saying." And O'Connell says, "Oh, no, I'm delighted for this opportunity to clarify what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I'm glad that snivelling coward is saying those words here where he's protected by the soldiers, because if he said them anywhere else, I would horsewhip him. Now, absolute chaos in the courtroom. The Attorney General intervenes, apologises for having said things that have offended O'Connell, and the case is allowed to resume. But that made O'Connell a marked man as well. And the same year, there was an interesting court case down in Limerick. And in it, O'Connell was running rings around his opposing counsel, Maurice McGrath. And McGrath was furious. And he kicked O'Connell under the desk. And O'Connell, furious in response, took up his leather brief bag and hit McGrath across the face. Well, both men furious, they went outside, and a challenge was issued, a duel was arranged, and the two men went off to fight a duel. And while they were on the field of battle and the pistols were being loaded, a mutual friend of both men intervened and said, "Look, Dan, no one saw him kick you, but everyone saw you hit him. So you've had the better of it. He'll apologise for that. You can shake hands. No one needs to get hurt." And O'Connell agreed. And the duel was cancelled. But that put a question mark in the minds of a lot of people about O'Connell's courage. Because the code of honour that surrounded duels in those days said that you could agree a compromise at any point in the process, but not when you had arrived at the field of battle. Because then it appeared that you were backing down because you were afraid of being killed. And even O'Connell's family members began to say, they're saying you're a coward. People are doubting that you're really the champion. They say you won't fight. And that all played into a very important event in January 1815, when O'Connell got into trouble for, ironically enough, one of his least obnoxious or aggressive speeches. A fairly general speech where he'd attacked Dublin Corporation as a beggarly corporation. But a trap was sprung. And those who wanted to end O'Connell encouraged a member of that corporation, a man called John Norcott de Stair, a former Royal Marine who was a crack shot, to challenge O'Connell to a duel. And he set out with the son of the Attorney General, both of them carrying horsewhips so that no one would lose or miss what message they were trying to send, marching down to the Four Courts, challenging O'Connell to a duel and denouncing him as a coward. And O'Connell knew he had no alternative but to accept the challenge. And he sent his friend, Major McNamara, himself a noted duellist, to arrange the duel. And it took place in Bishop's Court in County Kildare. A huge crowd gathered. Supporters of de Stair, members of Dublin Corporation, many of them carrying pistols, O'Connell supporters, his friends, and they went to the field. They were being lined up by their seconds, McNamara and de Stair's second. And McNamara started giving O'Connell some advice. And he said, okay, look, I'm going to take away this white thing around your neck that might help his aim. Take away these chains, because if the bullet goes there, it'll press in and hurt you. And look, this is what you need to remember. This is what you need to do. And O'Connell just put his hands on his friend's shoulders and he says, "My dear friend, can I ask one thing of you?" And McNamara said, "Anything. Please shut up and don't say another word until the duel is over." So the pistols were loaded, the men were lined up. There wasn't any counting to 10 because previously de Stair in another duel had fired early. So the signal was given and then both men raised their pistols. De Stair fired first, but the bullet only went as far as O'Connell's feet. And then a split second later, O'Connell fired and de Stair fell. And there was a huge cheer from O'Connell's supporters. A doctor ran to give medical attention to D'Astaire. O'Connell's supporters lifted him up and cheered him, and he went straight back to Dublin in the carriage. And his friends in the carriage were jubilant. And they said, I think you killed him. I think you shot him in the head. And O'Connell said, no, I shot him in the leg, but I fear from the way he fell that this is going to prove fatal. And they said, but I don't think so. It all happened so fast. Like, how can you know that? And O'Connell said, I shot him in the leg. I could have shot him wherever I wanted. Because O'Connell, in the same way that he had trained his voice to become this great orator, in the same way that he had trained his mind to become this great lawyer, he had also, over the past 15 years, trained at pistols so that he was a crack shot, just in case he was ever having to fight a duel like that. And D'Astaire did die because of his wounds. He exonerated O'Connell on his deathbed, and as a result, O'Connell wasn't prosecuted. And you might like to think that that's what turned O'Connell so much against violence, but it actually wasn't. O'Connell became more aggressive and more violent after that. He challenged Robert Peel, the future Prime Minister, future Home Secretary, denounced him as Orange Peel, said that he had been squeezed out of some factory in England, and then O'Connell challenged Peel to a duel. And Mary O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell's wife, intervened and told the police. And the police intervened and told O'Connell, you will be prosecuted if you fight this duel against the Chief Secretary. And O'Connell told his wife, well, I'm off to Cork for a legal case. And he got the boat to England and was going to go from there to France to fight the duel. And he was rearrested. He was arrested in London and told, if you fight the duel, no matter what happens, win or lose, you will be prosecuted. And O'Connell was forced to say, the duel can't go ahead. And he felt cheated out of it. But it was only after that that O'Connell had a kind of spiritual reawakening. He found a confessor, a Carmelite priest up in Clarendon Street. He returned to the Catholic faith. And suddenly the death of D'Astaire began to weigh heavily on him, and this belief that he had blood on his hands. And he vowed after that never to fight a duel again. And people in England didn't understand that. People in England thought he was a coward and a scoundrel and a rogue and a charlatan, because he would insult people. Henry Harding he called a one-armed miscreant. The man had lost his arm in the Battle of Waterloo, and so on. Disraeli challenged him to a duel, but he would refuse to fight. The American ambassador refused to fight. And O'Connell would say, they call me a coward? Well, you know what? I wish I was a coward. I wish I'd been a coward back in 1815. But sadly, there is proof that I'm not a coward. And O'Connell just didn't care what people thought. He would follow his own code and do his own thing. And O'Connell's great movement was that movement for civil rights in the 1820s. But it was an apathetic, moribund movement, because people did not believe that emancipation would ever be secured. And O'Connell would begin every speech with the same two lines from Lord Byron. Hereditary slaves know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. And what he was telling the Irish people was that you are slaves, but you know what? You deserve to be slaves, because you are not getting involved in trying to win your own freedom. And what O'Connell believed was that you couldn't rely on people in London to do this for you. You had to get involved yourself. But no one went to the meetings. There was a quorum. 10 people had to be at the meetings of the Catholic Association, or it was cancelled. And so many of the meetings were cancelled because only 8 or fewer would turn up. And O'Connell came up with this great idea of the Catholic rent, penny a month. Crowdsourcing, we would call it now. Get everyone involved, make everyone feel that they have a share in the movement. But when he wanted to propose that idea, the meeting was cancelled because there was only 8 people at it. And the next week, he wanted to propose it, but again, there was only 8 people. So it was held upstairs, and there was a bookshop downstairs, and O'Connell went down, and there were 2 Catholic priests there, and O'Connell said, I need you upstairs. Priests were honorary members, and they go, no, we're not getting involved in politics. But he shoved them up so that they were there for the count, and then they withdrew, and O'Connell proposed this idea. And no one understood what the Catholic rent was, the penny a month. People laughed at it. But what it meant was that everyone could be part of the movement. Young people, old people, rich people, poor people, some paying more if they could afford it. But everyone feeling that this was their movement. And so the movement grew. And the movement got bigger and bigger. And in 1828, O'Connell decided, whenever there is an election, I am going to stand wherever it takes place. Because the rules say a Catholic can't take a seat in Parliament, but there's nothing to say you can't try to win that seat. And a by-election was called in County Clare because the sitting MP, V.C. Fitzgerald, he was appointed to a position in the government, and so he had to run for re-election. And O'Connell decided, even though he had no connection with County Clare, he would run. And he set out for the county, and all along the way, crowds came to touch the carriage as it went by. And in Tipperary, they unhitched the horses because they wanted to drag the carriage in themselves. An enterprising merchant in County Clare began selling handkerchiefs with the phrase on it, O'Connell be with you. And that's what people began saying in Clare, may O'Connell be with you. But the government was convinced that O'Connell running would lead to violence because elections in Ireland were famous for 2 things. A lot of people drank a lot of alcohol, and the alcohol led to fights. And the army was sent down with orders to open fire if there was any trouble. So O'Connell sent down what became known as the orator. There was to be no drinking of alcohol in County Clare for the 3 weeks of the campaign. There was to be no violence or retaliation. And people did try to provoke. But if someone tried to, they would say, remember the order. That terrified the British government more than anything else. Robert Peel, now the Home Secretary, said that British power in Ireland was being shivered to atoms because what O'Connell was showing was that he controlled the people. And this was an open vote at this time. People, if they wanted to vote for O'Connell, would have to do it in full view of their landlord, in full view of everyone. So there was a lot at stake for people. And O'Connell went down to the hustings. And his opponent, V.C. Fitzgerald, who was a very liberal landlord, supported emancipation, but he was supporting the Wellington government that was opposed to emancipation. And V.C. Fitzgerald's father was a patriot, had opposed the Act of Union. And V.C. Fitzgerald gave a speech where he broke down in tears and he said, my father doesn't know I'm being opposed in this election. He's on his deathbed. And I think if he knew I was being opposed, it would kill him. And then he broke down in tears and he goes, oh, I'm sorry. And the crowd were like crying as well, going, no, go on, go on. And he goes, you know me. You know I'm a good landlord. You know I support you. And at the end of his speech, everyone in that room thought Fitzgerald, great guy, the poor father. So what was O'Connell to do? If he attacked him, he'd look like a bully. If he agreed with him, then it removed any grounds for supporting him. So O'Connell did what he always did. Started with a few jokes. Started with a few funny stories. Started answering some of the charges that V.C. Fitzgerald had complained that O'Connell and his team had been accusing V.C. Fitzgerald of embezzling £50,000 over his time in the government. And he said, oh, come on, now, I'm sure it's not 50,000. It's probably only 5,000. And O'Connell also addressed the charges that had been made by another barrister who proposed Fitzgerald, a man called Gore. And he said, you know, Gore and I, we started off as barristers in the exact same year, 1798. He has no practice and gets no work. I have a huge, thriving practice. The thing that stopped him from going anywhere was his lack of talent. The thing that stops me from going further is my religion. So am I to be taunted by a briefless barrister, a bigot without business? And then O'Connell turned to the most important part of his argument. And he said, charges have been made against me, including here. And they've said that why do I want emancipation? Because then I can become a King's Counsel and I can earn £1,000 more a year. O'Connell was already earning £8,000 a year. Huge sums of money in those days. Huge practice. And O'Connell said, well, it is true. If emancipation passes, I will be able to do other types of cases. I will be able to finally be promoted. I will be able to do, and it will bring in more money. But the truth is, I could have earned more money at any point over the last 30 years if I'd given up politics and devoted myself purely to the law. But instead, I leave my house first thing in the morning and I go to the courts and I do a full day of work. And then I become the agitator and I do another full days of work, arranging meetings, arranging the campaign, fighting for rights. And by the time I come home, it is late at night and my children are asleep and I don't see them and I've made a lot of sacrifices. And there are times when I think about shedding a tear. And sometimes when I'm tucking them in, I do shed a tear. But I shed my tears in private, for I do not cry in public. And suddenly there's a ooh. And suddenly V.C. Fitzgerald has gone from being this kind-hearted figure of sympathy to now being this crybaby that they're going to make fun of. And he then launched into his attack on Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald put his head in his hands and he said, where is this going to end? Where is this going to end? 3 days of voting and O'Connell wins the seat. And that forces the king to concede emancipation. He doesn't want to. But Wellington, the Prime Minister, goes to him and says, I defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. I could defeat O'Connell if he rose up in rebellion. We could easily crush them and kill them and put it down. But we can't open fire on an unarmed people. We can't kill them. We have to pass this. And the king tried to replace Wellington, but no one would take on the job. And so the king was forced reluctantly to concede it, saying, I'm no longer the King of Ireland. O'Connell is the King of Ireland, and I'm merely the Duke of Windsor. And so O'Connell was hailed as the liberator, and people lifted him up and carried him from Clare to Limerick. And then when he tried to give a speech, they all drowned him out with their cheering and applause. And O'Connell laughed and he said, this is the first time in my life I haven't been able to be heard, but I don't mind. And then, becoming a member of Parliament, he became then the great supporter of a range of causes: Jewish emancipation, freeing the slaves, the rights of people wherever they were oppressed. But his great dream, his great vision, was to repeal the Act of Union and restore an Irish Parliament. And that movement went nowhere. And by the 1840s, people began to think that O'Connell was too old and he was past it and he should step down. And in 1843, he revealed, this will be the year of repeal. And even his friends laughed. But what O'Connell did was he decided to bring the campaign to the public and let everyone hear the case for an Irish Parliament. And these meetings became known as monster meetings because they grew in size. The first one in Trim 16th of March 1843, about 50,000 people attended. By the summer, they were getting crowds of hundreds of thousands. And the British government began to panic because they thought, we don't trust O'Connell. He says he won't fight, but if he was to ever give the order, we would have a whole country up in arms against us. And so there was a huge monster meeting scheduled for Clontarf, the scene of the great victory of Brian Boru, and the government swooped and declared that it was an illegal meeting, sent in the army and gunboats, orders to open fire if the people gathered. And O'Connell made that decision to cancel that meeting, and I think he has never really been forgiven by so many Irish people for that. So many people think he should have gone ahead, to hell with it if hundreds, thousands were killed. It would have maybe kick-started a rebellion like 1798, perhaps like 1916. But O'Connell would not have blood on his hands. He would say the only blood he would sacrifice was his own. And O'Connell cancelled the meeting. The government swooped in. He was arrested, charged, found guilty, sentenced to imprisonment. And that conviction was later overturned because there were so many flaws in the whole process, including the fact that the names of eligible Catholic jurors had been ripped out of the jury book when the jury was being selected. And O'Connell then, in his later years, was consumed by just one thing: the potato blight that hit Ireland in 1845 and what was going to happen to his people. And he began using his own money to send food in. He began pleading with the government for things to happen. And in 1847, the start of the worst year of the famine, he decided to give his last speech in the British House of Commons before going off to try and get a blessing from the Pope in Rome before he died. And even though his voice was going, he kept telling his friends, I've been saving my strength for one last speech. And he stood up in the House of Commons. There was a huge funeral, huge celebration, not a huge celebration, a huge outpouring of mourning and grief and loss in May 1847, even though it was such a terrible time in the middle of the famine. And afterwards, O'Connell's reputation sometimes was up and sometimes was down. But after 1916, there were many who felt that O'Connell had been too much the man of peace, and that if he'd only been prepared to try other means, he could have done more. And Eamon de Valera, as President of Ireland, addressed that when he was reopening Derrynane as a national monument, national museum in the 1960s. And he said that his generation, the revolutionary generation, had hated O'Connell because they felt that he should have done more. And he said that they were wrong because they hadn't realized or appreciated that they would never have been able to achieve what they achieved in 1916 and in the years afterwards if O'Connell hadn't won his great victories in the 19th century. That O'Connell had raised up a broken people, and he had convinced them that they were more than slaves. When Charles de Gaulle resigned as president of the French Republic, the first place he went to was Ireland, to Kerry, to Derrynane, because his favourite book growing up was a biography of Daniel O'Connell written by de Gaulle's grandmother. And he found much to admire in the story of this tall, heroic figure who represented the dreams and aspirations and rights of her people. And de Gaulle went to the house at Derrynane and wrote in the visitor's book in honour of the liberator. And I think that we need to remember and reclaim the memory of O'Connell. I think that we should be ashamed that O'Connell is more celebrated in parts of the world outside of Ireland than he is in this country. I think it is so brilliant that O'Connell has been such a focus of these events celebrating Dublin 8. And I think it is so important that in this year of his birth, August will mark the 250th anniversary of his birth, that I think it is so important that we do remember and mark that, but also remember and prepare for the bicentenaries that are approaching. O'Connell winning his seat, the bicentenary will be 2028. The bicentenary of the Emancipation Act passing, 2029. The bicentenary of O'Connell taking his seat in Parliament, 2030. They were all notable achievements. And what they showed was the power of the people, mass democracy, peaceful protest. What they showed was that what could be achieved by the people acting together. But what they also remind us of is about the power of these rights that were won at that time, and rights that you see being challenged and undermined around the world. Freedom, democracy itself. All of these principles and beliefs that Daniel O'Connell dedicated his life to, we need to be reminded of their power, of how much people sacrificed to win them. And we have to renew our own commitment to speaking up and speaking out and being voices for liberty, for freedom, for human rights, for civil rights. Because O'Connell was our champion. He did raise a people who were on its knees, and he convinced them that they were more than slaves. And in this, the year of his birth, we should celebrate him as our chieftain, as our champion, and yes, as our liberator. Thank you. I went on a bit. But we have time for questions. Yep.
In relation to the election in Clare, was it? Who actually had the right to vote for him at that point? Since I assume most of the people would have been most investors in his cause, wouldn't have had the right to vote.
Yeah, very good question. So Catholics were given the right to vote in 1793, if they were renting a freehold that was, worth 40 shillings, so it was the 40 shilling freeholders. Now they were disenfranchised afterwards as part of kind of almost the retaliation, and O'Connell conceded that, but then they won their votes back afterwards. So there were eligible Catholic voters, but I suppose the big challenge was you were voting against the wishes of your landlord, and therefore you risked eviction. So one of the purposes of the Catholic rent was to give support to families who were evicted. And you do have stories told of people being forced by their landlords. You're going to vote for Fitzgerald today, and being dragged to the polling booth. And then O'Connell would just go out onto the balcony of his hotel room, and he would just raise his arms, and they would then vote for O'Connell, that he would just win them back just with the gesture. So there was a lot at stake in that, but people were more courageous than perhaps O'Connell himself had even predicted in the earlier part of the decade. Yeah.
Sorry, what was the relationship between Arthur Wellesley and O'Connell like in the later years? Was there much of a relationship between the two?
They always say that line about Wellington, that Wellington, when asked about his Irish birth, being born in a stable just to make it. That was actually O'Connell said that. Yeah. That was a joke that O'Connell came up with. That sure, we have Wellington now. He's meant to be an Irishman. Well, just because you're born in a stable doesn't make you a horse. O'Connell didn't like him, and Partly, it was also, O'Connell was a huge admirer of Napoleon and was hugely disappointed when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. So I think there was loads of reasons why he didn't like Wellington. But that was, he abused Wellington quite a lot in the 1840s.
Having come from Kerry in the 1770s, would he have spoken Irish? And did he ever talk about Irish language and saving it, or did he talk all through English?
He was fluent in Irish. It would have been his first language. He regretted after emancipation not changing his surname to O'Connell and going back to an Irish version. He says O'Connell is an English imposition. So he sometimes gave speeches in Irish. There was one time for one of these monster meetings, he would do the banquet dinner afterwards. There were all reporters there and government agents. So he gave the entire speech in Irish. But O'Connell also, despite his great love of the Irish language, is very often criticised by Irish language enthusiasts for something he said in the 1830s, where he said that despite his love of the language, he believed that, he said, and I'm sufficiently utilitarian to believe that our children will need English to get by, and that therefore that's what we have to. So he's kind of criticised for that he had some kind of opposition, but it wasn't. It was from a practical sense. But he had a great love of the Irish language, and he was fluent in it. And I suppose that he would have probably liked a country where they were fluent in Irish and English, but that he recognised that Ireland would not be successful just speaking Irish alone. Different locations like that. So a lot of the meetings were held in this the room upstairs in a bookstore, and they would kind of have a number of these locations. So some of them were quite near here. Sometimes you had the meetings being interrupted by students from Trinity. Students from Trinity caused him all kinds of problems. And on the quays, there were porters of coal, the coal porters, and they would come in to help O'Connell, and they would take the Trinity students and throw them into the Liffey. And O'Connell would later say, we would never have passed emancipation only for those porters, because they sorted out the troublemakers and the people interrupting. So they were held around Dublin, and but hard to generate interest in a movement when it wasn't that people didn't want emancipation, they just felt nothing we do will make any difference. We have to rely on people in Britain to change their mind. But what O'Connell did is he forced them to have to change their mind, because otherwise Ireland would be ungovernable.
Absolutely brilliant speech. What was how did he deal with the violent revolutionaries, particularly Wolfe Tone, Presbyterian lawyer, man after equal rights for all the people of the island?
See, O'Connell, his great hero in the 1790s, one of them was Lord Edward Fitzgerald. And O'Connell remembered, Lord Edward was such a celebrity, people cutting their hair short in honour of him, the croppy stuff. O'Connell remembered running in front of him and then looking around to catch a look at him. And then, of course, O'Connell would say, of course, they do that now for me. But he became a huge critic of 1798 afterwards. Huge critic. And he liked to claim, whether he believed it or not, he liked to claim this conspiracy theory that the British government had deliberately provoked the 1798 rebellion to bring in a union. But what he certainly believed was that the trouble with 1798 is that you had these, eloquent Protestant leaders who would encourage the people, largely Catholic, to rise up, but that it was the Catholic people who largely suffered, and that they bore the brunt of the oppression and the torture and the burnings and all of that. And he felt they had been pretty much abandoned by the leaders. So he was hugely critical of 1798 afterwards. and would always denounce it. But whether he felt that at the time, maybe not. But it became kind of part of the mythology afterwards. I think what O'Connell feared was uncontrollable mob violence, that he saw that you could have something like 1798 where the ideals and principles could be good, but that once the fighting starts, you then have atrocities on both sides and you have murder and you can't control it. And O'Connell did not like that. So he feared the effects of violence, and he in the 1820s, when a German visitor came, because people came from around the world to stay with O'Connell, to visit him, to see him in action, he was asked, well, would you support a revolution if you were guaranteed it would succeed? And he said, I'm almost afraid to consider that. So in 1825, perhaps yes. If he was given that guarantee, violent revolution, guarantee it will succeed, he might have gone for it. By the 1840s, he would have been against it no matter what. Because by that point, he was much more religious, much more devout, much more concerned about these other issues. So the O'Connell of the 1840s is different to the O'Connell of the 1820s. And the O'Connell of the 1820s is different from the 1810s and from the 1790s. Like O'Connell in the 1790s is getting drunk at night, and he's going out and getting into fights and causing trouble, and he's a much more hot-headed individual. The O'Connell of the 1840s barely drinks anything. They give him a little glass of champagne after a monster meeting speech, but he really drinks nothing. But he's a very different figure. But we tend to think of O'Connell as that older figure throughout the life. So we see the O'Connell in our heads is O'Connell always the man of peace, the older man, that figure who's looking down at us from the statue on O'Connell Street. But if you met the O'Connell who was 25 years old, I think you would have found a very different figure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, excellent lecture. What's your view on cancelling Clontarf? The fact that he was renowned for his leadership, and if you think of the situation, you had professional army had come into the bay, and he was with all these peasant Irish people, most of them unarmed. What's your view that he actually made an excellent leadership decision in cancelling Clontarf, and it should never be considered a weakness?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it was, funnily enough, it was supported by all the people around him, the Young Irelanders, even though later they denounced it. But at the time, they were all in favour. No one was in any doubt. I think the problem is they weren't ready for any conflict. I think you would have had, thousands would have been killed.
Yeah, of course.
Many thousands, tens of thousands. And if O'Connell had led a group of 10 people there and they'd opened fire and O'Connell was killed, people would have risen up there would have been a huge outcry, but there would have been no planning, and it would have been just a massacre. And I don't think it would have gained anything. So I think it probably was but I think part of the problem is that O'Connell's repeal strategy, it was nearing the end of the road anyway, because he was kind of hoping that this show of moral force would persuade the British government to back down, but they weren't backing down. So where do you go from there? And he didn't really have somewhere else to go.
Could you tell us something about his founding of O'Connell School in 1828?
Yeah. Like O'Connell was an innovator, and O'Connell was a big believer in creating opportunities for others. So, for example, the brewery, Guinness, was very much a Protestant brewery, and so he started his own brewery in the 1830s, O'Connell, so you could get your pint of O'Connell's, and set up his own bank. and O'Connell's face on the banknotes. So you could go in and pay for your, that there were restrictions on Catholics and where they could be buried. So he was involved in the discussions led to the creation of Glasnevin. You see it with education. So these are things that he would have been maybe tangentially involved in, but as a way of ensuring that there was. Now, most of them ended in failure. Like the bank, I think it was taken over by what became Bank of Ireland. The brewery was not a success. O'Connell was terrible with money and was always in debt. So he relied on the money he would inherit from Hunting Cap when Hunting Cap died. And Hunting Cap, he was expecting to die at any time, but Hunting Cap lived till he was 97. And he died in 1825 when O'Connell was 50. And so, in a way, O'Connell was spoilt from always having this expectation of wealth. But I think what you see with that is it's part of O'Connell's branding, it's part of O'Connell's, trying to provide, I think, meaningful opportunities and equal opportunities for Catholics. And that was a very big part of his mission. Yeah, like O'Connell was a big supporter of, because of course there were restrictions against Jews in the and O'Connell was part of that, speaking in favour of that and being an advocate for that in the 1830s. You don't really see at other times O'Connell could be quite, maybe not an imperialist, but that O'Connell, for example, he supported the Opium War with China. O'Connell was in some ways an old-fashioned figure from the 18th century as well, in terms of some of his beliefs. He was in favour of women speaking at that World Anti-Slavery Convention because some women delegates had come over and they'd been refused permission to speak, and O'Connell was asked to intervene. He says, well, actually, at first I was against, but when you think about it, we should be against any discrimination because of your colour, because of your gender. And but in many ways, he was kind of rooted in the past. The area where he was his most radical was about slavery, because even a lot of white abolitionists believed that white people were superior. They just didn't like slavery because they thought it was against the law of God. But O'Connell was different in being a white person who was against slavery because of an emotional, empathic reaction. So he wasn't enlightened in all of his views and could be quite conservative in some of his views and quite conservative in some of his social views in the 1830s. So in the 1840s, he spoke a lot in Parliament, but you see him, speaking across a range of it, sometimes on an enlightened side, sometimes not. But I don't think he was a separatist who believed in Ireland being he wanted Ireland to have its own Parliament, but probably as part of that wider British system.
How did they succeed where he failed, or did they learn from what worked and what didn't?
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, that's a very good. Parnell did learn an awful lot in terms of, the power you can have when you have a disciplined party, and O'Connell was trying to introduce that so that, he held the balance of power in 1835. O'Connell did, and he was able to get what became known as Justice for Ireland then. So he was working with the Whigs and able to get in various reforms. And Parnell, of course, was able to use that with the balance of power to get Gladstone to become a convert to Home Rule and support the first Home Rule bill. So yeah, I think they did have an impact. And I think you do see a kind of a tradition there that continues. and I think it's about using Parliament in a way to be able to press for your ultimate objective. That Parnell probably found a prime minister who was able to work with him and prepared to work with him in a way that O'Connell couldn't. And that's why O'Connell then decided, well, now I'm going to put pressure on them outside of Parliament. And that became the monster meetings. Yep.
What did his practice at the bar look like? And with attorneys and solicitors who were instructing him, was there an ideological thing there? Were they Catholic or more liberal-minded? Or was it just purely?
Yeah, like O'Connell had a very wide practice, and there were certain cases he couldn't do as a Catholic. Very often, if it was a case that you had to have a senior barrister with it, usually the rule was that the senior barrister would cross-examine the first witness or depose the first witness, and then the junior, the next witness, and so on. So what they would have to do is have a senior barrister there, but they would give that person all the unimportant witnesses. So the unimportant witnesses would be 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and all the crucial witnesses were 2, 4, 6, 8. But it ate away at O'Connell, because if you're ambitious, and O'Connell was ambitious, if you're prevented from doing certain things because of this barrier, and you see people who are nowhere near as talented going ahead, that really annoyed him. And that angered him. But he did everything. Like, he's kind of remembered as he became known as the counselor for defending people who are on trial for life. But at times he also defended people who were murderers, who were not innocent. And at times he was prosecuting. Like, he wasn't just always just on the side of the people. He had a very wide practice. And but most famously, he kind of gave it up pretty much gave it up after emancipation, except when there was these people on trial, the Doneraile conspiracy, very dodgy evidence. The first 4 were convicted, and then the family member rode to Derrynane to say, O'Connell, they'll all be strung up like sheep unless you do something. And O'Connell got into his carriage and travelled overnight and arrived at the court the next morning, bursting in to defend the next 4. And what he discovered was that the evidence was all corrupt and tainted, and so he saved all of those people. And that contributed to his legend as well. But there was kind of a legend around it as well. So in the public mind, he's always on the side of the people. Whereas I suppose if you look at the practice, he's doing all kinds of cases. But it was a big practice, £8,000 a year. He could certainly have been earning more than that if he was just solely devoted to the law. And certainly would have been earning more again if he had been practicing as a King's Counsel. But they were things that actually ate away at him. They are things that angered him because he needed the money. His family, he was terrible with money. He was always spending way too much, and he needed the money.
Bet that annoyed his wife a lot.
It didn't.
And you'll, not again. We're in debt again. How many times have I told you to be wise with our money?
That is it exactly.
I marry you.
Well, that is exactly it. He would come up with crazy ideas to save money. So he sent his wife and children over to Paris because he thought it'd be cheaper there, and borrowed money off his brother because he thought, because people kept coming to them, because he was the chieftain, figuring, can we borrow money and all this. But he ended up going further into debt with that. And his brother said, but of course, Paris is the most expensive city in Europe. How did you think that was going to save money? But there was a real weakness there when it came to money. It was a real problem that he had. Yeah.
I've heard somewhere that he was considered at one point to become a ruler in Belgium. Is that true, or is that myth?
The Belgian Parliament had to vote on it was some constitutional issue or something, had to vote on who'd be the new monarch. And I think O'Connell received 3 votes. because he'd been educated there. And once when he was visiting France, they said, if you had been born here, we would make you king of the French, and so on. So O'Connell always liked those, kind of European. He was a huge European icon, and that European identity was a huge part of his identity.
You referenced that there are events that happen elsewhere around the world that celebrate O'Connell. What ones would those be?
Not so much events, just the way you would find that his speeches on slavery would be republished in the United States, the way they were republished on the eve of the Civil War, the way O'Connell would, I suppose you just see him appearing in places. FDR, one of FDR's key advisors, Moley wrote a biography of O'Connell. That O'Connell was someone who was had this huge kind of international reputation, and still has, even in the fact that when President Obama visited Ireland in 2011 and delivered a speech that was broadcast on television outside College Green, and I remember I was there in the audience, but Obama only referenced one Irish historical figure, and that was Daniel O'Connell. And he had planned to go to Glasnevin to pay his respects at the grave, but that was the time of the ash cloud, and the ash cloud meant that he had to leave a day earlier, and so that wasn't possible. But Yoko Ono, I remember at the same time, was in Dublin, and she went to to Glasnevin and put her own wreath there. So O'Connell is a figure who, in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Captain Nemo has portraits of all of the great figures on the wall, and in between, Lincoln, the Emancipator, and Washington, there is Daniel O'Connell. But when that book was translated into English and published in English, they left out O'Connell. And it's only in recent years that you can find an English language version that has O'Connell back in. Bismarck is alleged to have said that Daniel O'Connell was a man I think I would have liked to have shot. And O'Connell was a big figure during the Cold War, a cardinal in Hungary, referencing him and praising him. That O'Connell was someone who showed what could be achieved through peaceful protest. And so there's that huge legacy there in terms of peaceful civil rights movements around the world.
Why do you think he's more celebrated maybe abroad than he is here, especially in recent times?
I think that we've maybe been conflicted about our history because, we've had the centenary of 1916. We like to celebrate that, the War of Independence, the centenary of us becoming a state, and so on. And it almost feels like you have to be one or the other. Who are you? Are you for O'Connell or are you for Pearse? Are you for 1916 or are you O'Connell? Now, you can only be one or the other. You can't be both. And I think that mindset maybe is too narrow. That that it doesn't have to be one or the other. Perhaps it might be, but it doesn't have to be. And I think if we have a broader approach to it, that we don't have to feel that by honouring O'Connell, we are renouncing these other things. And so I think we can have a more balanced, more nuanced, maybe more sophisticated view of our history and acknowledge and celebrate the different parts of it. Yeah, the marathon.
I enjoyed your presentation. Do you ever think that his birthplace will be restored?
The house there, the small house. I don't know, that's a good question. I suppose because most people associate Derrynan, but of course the house where he was born was at Carron, just outside Carsavine, and there in Carsavine you have the only Catholic church, I think in the world, but certainly in Ireland, named after someone who's not a saint, named after O'Connell. I don't know. I don't know if there would be either the public interest or the government funding for that, because they might feel that it might create, too which is the place you go to if you want to see. You go to Derrynane, or do you go? But I don't know. It's an interesting one. It's an interesting one. For those who are interested in O'Connell, I'm organising a conference on O'Connell in Trinity at the end of July, and there'll be details on Eventbrite. And but Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, is opening it, and we're looking at they're not just history papers, but papers about civil rights and human rights challenges today. So it's half and half, and looking at other contexts and looking at places around the world. And so it's very much the life, but it's also the legacy. But no, I think that's an interesting one. I would be almost more interested in seeing more done to educate about O'Connell. The truth of it is, I think O'Connell is better understood in Northern Ireland than in the South, and I think O'Connell is better understood in many schools in England than here, because Daniel O'Connell is on the A-level history curriculum in a very significant way. I give a lot of talks, sometimes in person, sometimes by Zoom, to schools in England and to schools in the North, not to schools in the South. And they do repeal, they do emancipation, they do the level of detail they go into, and the level of knowledge that you see in schools that are ostensibly Protestant and schools that are ostensibly Catholic and schools that are mixed. But I think if you were to talk to history students on the island, you will get a more nuanced reading of O'Connell from students in the North than and I think that's a problem. And I think that O'Connell, now the programme for government does say that they want to develop educational packs around O'Connell and to bring out some of these areas. But I certainly hope that does happen, because I think people don't really, I don't think people really properly understand how O'Connell was this internationally respected figure. They don't understand or know about the slavery dimension. I think they don't really understand what emancipation is or what it meant. They don't really understand repeal. So I think there's an awful lot of ignorance about O'Connell and about the 19th century. And I think maybe the educational system needs to look at itself, and because these are important issues, not just about our history, but they're important issues in terms of values that matter. And I think that by neglecting those, we're doing a disservice to the next generation, and I think we're doing a disservice to our history, and I think we're doing a disservice to our country, whatever view you take on the issues.
Can I just say on that point, just even as kind of curating the festival and researching a bit about O'Connell, and it's interesting, like there's been a lot of like feedback from people about him where they're kind of like seeing him in a really negative way, or they're not really fully understanding maybe the bigger picture or his real kind of his true character basically. Yeah. And I have come across a lot of that, which is interesting. And yeah, I think you're right. There's probably a little bit of re-education.
Yeah, like the problem is the branding. They chose emancipation as their branding because they wanted to link in with the emancipation movement, abolitionism of slavery. But for us, that is a bad branding, because when you say Catholic emancipation, what people think, what people hear, is they think what he did was achieve the dominance of the Catholic Church in this country, which paved the way for the dominance of the Catholic Church in the newly independent state, and all the problems that we have had with Magdalene laundries and the treatment of women and abuse of children, and all of this all stems from us giving the bishops and the priests too much power in Ireland. And that was all starting with O'Connell. That's the problem. And O'Connell is at the start of all of that. Whereas O'Connell actually believed in the separation of church and state. And when he was Lord Mayor of Dublin, he was delighted that his very first case, because he had to preside over certain, was that he sided against a Catholic priest, because he wanted, and he was very keen about, he wanted the repeal movement to be very clear, non-sectarian. Like, he was very much against. The Catholic Church very often disagreed with him during the Emancipation campaign. And he would denounce them and say, I'm not going to be dictated to by the Vatican or by the bishops. He stood up against the bishops. So he didn't want that kind of, like, he would have been as horrified by the abuses and the things that went wrong in the 20th century. That wasn't the Ireland that he wanted. But when you talk about Catholic emancipation, people kind of see it as opening the door for all of that. And that's what kills him. Yeah.
Just on the northern thing, like Mary Magdalene's went on a honeymoon, I think, to Derrynagh, and like on the way to her wedding, a friend of hers was killed in sectarian violence, and one of her heroes was Daniel O'Connell. And also there's a fabulous novel by Colin McCann called Transatlantic.
Yeah.
Daniel O'Connell is a character in it. There's also a plot and a time in the peace process. And it's just a lovely historical novel that's really well researched.
No, it is brilliant, and it has the Frederick Douglass and all of that. No, so many figures, so many have admired O'Connell because O'Connell, he represents that ideal in terms of what can be achieved. And Charles Dickens hugely admired him. You mentioned he appears off stage in Martin Chuzzlewit. There's a huge figure. There's a huge meeting in Martin Chuzzlewit goes to a fictional town in America, and they're having a meeting, and they're about to send off a check of money to this great Irish figure. But then they discover that he's an opponent of slavery, and they rip up the check, and they say they would have killed him if he was there. But that was because Dickens loved O'Connell. He loved him for his opposition to slavery. He loved him as an orator, because Dickens was a parliamentary kind of sketch writer before he became a novelist. And he would be moved to tears by O'Connell's speeches. And I do think that some of O'Connell's speeches inspired some parts of Dickens' novels, including scenes in the Old Curiosity Shop where they're going through and seeing the dead on the street and all of that, images from 1798 that O'Connell would have described. But O'Connell was this hugely iconic figure and hugely, in Britain, a divisive figure. Like, many in Britain saw him as a kind of a Trump figure. They thought, this guy is a charlatan. He's just fooling the Irish people. And so he was divisive like that as well, because they kind of couldn't understand how he had that genuine connection with the people and kind of looked down on him for it. I don't want to end on that point now. We can't end on a...
When is the conference?
The conference is the 28th and 29th of July. Haven't put it up on Eventbrite. We have to work out the panels yet, but it'll probably up on the Trinity website and tcd.ie and Eventbrite probably in the next few weeks or so. But it's free of charge and you're all fair. I want to see you back. I want to see you all back for it. Yeah, we'll end on a good question.
Okay, so as far as the education system within Ireland, played down the works of Daniel O'Connell at the growing of the likes of Pearse and the revolutionary side of 1916, and with the advent of all the centennials that went on over the last few years, do you think that actually pushed O'Connell's memory and how he saw him down into the doldrums and put up the likes of Pearse and Conway and the likes of those?
Yeah, I also think maybe it's... when I was a student, the 19th century was kind of like the big thing. But now we're in the 21st century, a quarter of the way through it. The 19th century is... the 20th century has really become where it's at. And I even noticed with my own students in Trinity, the 20th century is really all they want to do. I used to teach a third and fourth year module, and it was called Ireland in the Age of O'Connell. But really it was about 1798 and Robert Emmet's Rebellion and O'Connell and all of this kind of stuff. The numbers just, because O'Connell just didn't... So I had to put 1916 in the title. And, it was Ireland in Rebellion and put 1916. And then the numbers soared up and huge. So, yeah, O'Connell just doesn't resonate. But 1916, because a lot of people just want 20th century history. And a lot of people